not easy. It's not easy being the shortest kid in the class. It doesn't get to be any easier when you're an adult. And all of the other guys are towering over you. You know, they're walking around like giants, 5'6", 5'7". And they look down on you like Greek gods from that Olympus thing. And they sneer at you when you're not looking. Sometimes even when you are. They'll sneer and they'll say clever things like, "Oh, how's the weather down there? Sorry, I didn't realize you were there. I looked right over you." And even when they're nice, then they're condescending. They'll pat you on the head or they'll smile sympathetically as they reach for something off the top shelf that you were struggling to get. You know, the transition from being a short kid to a short adult means you go from not, getting picked for teams to not being respected because you're short. I came to realize that was okay. It's okay because once you realize that you're not going to get respected, that's kind of liberating. Because if people are going to look down on you anyway, if people are going to sneer and make nasty comments anyway, then why not give them a real reason to hate you? That's why I became a tax collector. Me, Zacchaeus. The runt, the pipsqueak, the dwarf, the midget. All of those things. I'm the tax collector. I'm not the tallest guy on the block, but I'm the only one who can ruin you with just a few strokes of the stylus. I'm not the biggest guy in town, but I'm the only one in town who can take everything you own and then put a lien on everything you ever will own. I'm the guy that can lay you out so low that your children and your grandchildren are going to be. And the beauty of it is it's all perfectly legal. Well, not perfect. It's all mostly legal. And when the complaint department for taxes is some Roman centurion from the 10th Legion who hates people more than I do, you just know complaints aren't going to go very far. So for me, anyway, life in Jericho was pretty good. I enjoyed what I did. And I began to hear these stories. Began to hear these stories, and first they were whispers. Tales that were told when I wasn't in the room, and stories that were hushed up when I entered. But I started to piece things together, and these stories started to grow more and more, until eventually people in Jericho were talking openly about this thing that was happening in the countryside. They started talking openly about this country preacher from Galilee. This rabbi who was walking all around the countryside, stirring up all sorts of commotion. And when I asked them what it was all about, mostly people would just shut up. They wouldn't talk to me. I think they were afraid of what I might think. Maybe they were afraid I would find a way to tax that too. But some of them did talk, and what I heard from them was it was just sort of a patchwork, and it didn't make sense to me. Because from what they were telling me, this guy, he was against sin, but he didn't want to punish it. He was against greed, But he didn't advocate taking money from the rich to give to the poor. He didn't speak against Rome, but he certainly spoke out against power and violence, and he spoke for the poor and the underprivileged. So the more I heard about this man, the more I realized that he was just a puzzle wrapped in a riddle. And it made me even more curious. And then one day, it's in the spring, one day I heard that this Jesus was coming to town. He was on his way to Jerusalem, but he was going to, of course, be passing through Jericho. And when I heard that, I resolved to see him and try to figure this out for myself and try to understand what it was he was saying. Then, when I knew he was coming, when I knew he was close to town, he was getting close to the walls, I couldn't see him. When he got near to the gates, I couldn't see him because there were so many other people in front of me, lining the side of the road, waiting for him. They were all taller than me. All these people were waiting to see him, and they were taller than me, and I couldn't see over them. And for the first time since I was a teenager, I cursed my size, and I realized that all of the power that I had wouldn't help me to see Jesus. And I stood there, and I could hear, and I could tell from the sounds that he was getting closer. There was more chatter. There were shouts, and there was laughter, and it was kind of rolling toward me like this wave rushing ashore. I looked around and I couldn't see anybody that might help me. There were no soldiers nearby. They would have helped. And there were no friends nearby that I could call on. Well, I had no friends. There was no one that would help me. And then I spotted it. I saw this tree by the side of the road. It was a sycamore tree. It was behind the crowd. But it was near enough to the road that I would be able to see. And the best part is it bent down low enough that I could climb onto it. So I pushed my way through the crowd, the back of the crowd. I started to climb the tree, and I skinned my shins as I went up the trunk. And then I kind of shimmied out on this stout branch. And then I reached up to the next branch, and I pulled myself up, and I climbed there, and I went out a little further, and I reached up for another branch, and I climbed, and I went a little further out. I scrambled branch by branch, as high as I could get. Pretty soon, I could look down on the tops of their heads. And then I was on another branch, and this one was even thinner, and I was kind of clinging to it for life at that point. But I was high enough to see the road. I was high enough to see what I thought had to be him. It was this knot of people. It was moving down the road, and the crowd was on all sides of it, but they would kind of get out of the way as we moved down the road. And by that time, the crowd was practically dancing around him, and the noise was this solid wall of sound that drowned out everything else. It's an amazing thing to see and to hear. I'd never seen excitement like that. Then as that knot of people drew up evenly, it stopped. I could make out individual men and women in there, and I tried to figure out who was who and which one was this Jesus person. And then the man in the middle of that crowd, he was an ordinary looking guy. He was unremarkable except for his eyes. They looked like they could see everything. They looked like they could see right into you. And I know that because first he scanned the crowd, and then he raised his head and he was looking, and it was like he was looking for me. And then all of a sudden he looked right at me. Right at me. And he raised his hand and he pointed and he said, "Zacchaeus, come down here. I'm staying in your house tonight." Zacchaeus, I'm staying with you tonight. If you take a dreidel and you spin it like a top, it'll just go round and round, and sometimes it'll wobble a little bit back and forth, but it'll just keep spinning. Then at some point during that spin, it leans over far enough that it has to fall. That's that point, that invisible point where everything changes. It goes from being a dreidel that spins to a dreidel that falls, and that's the closest I can come to explaining what happened. In that moment when Jesus pointed to me and called to me, because at that exact moment in my life, it changed. I'd never heard him speak before. I'd never seen him. I'd never heard his message. But then Jesus picked me out of that crowd. He picked me, sinner among sinners, out of that crowd, and he invited himself into my life without me ever asking. And it was as though every bad thing I had ever done in my entire life was suddenly there for him to see. I was instantly ashamed. Then it was also as though this man whom I had never met picked me out of a crowd and he said, "I see you, Zacchaeus. I care about you. And no matter what you've done, I want to sit at dinner with you. I want to know you, and I want you to know me." And suddenly I knew somehow that whatever I had done in my life, and there was plenty that wasn't good, whatever I had done with my life, I had worth in that man's eyes. Whatever I had done, he could see past that to something better. And that changed my heart. Like I said, I can't explain it. I don't understand it. I even talked about it with him that very night, and I was still as confused when I was done as when we started. I understood that wasn't unusual after talking to Jesus. And then I talked about it with others later as I began to set right whatever I had done wrong, and I began to restore what I had stolen. I returned it fourfold. And I worked hard to right the other wrongs that I had done and to show compassion in a way that I had never shown it before. And I did all this, and I was still confused about why I was doing it. And the people around me who knew only the old Zacchaeus, that short, bitter man, they were confused as well. And I was still doing all that when I heard that this Jesus had died in Jerusalem. I heard that he had died a traitor's death on the cross. And I felt that something very special had been taken out of my life, and that broke my heart. Then a couple days later, when the first rumors started to fly, and people who had once feared me began to come to me and whisper that something miraculous had happened in Jerusalem. And Jesus had risen from the tomb. When I first heard that, I didn't know what to make of it. But the very idea that he had come back, it made my heart soar. It flew. Thinking about it, I realized that on that day in Jericho, Jesus had taught me that even a hardened heart can turn toward repentance and justice. And if what I heard about him being, I guess we call it resurrected, if that's true, then I know that he's taught me something even greater. God's love cannot be conquered. And yet God's grace cannot be denied. I guess that's what he was trying to teach me. No matter who we are, when Jesus calls us, we can change. No matter what we've done, when Jesus calls us, we can be better. Because the life we've led does not define us any more than death can end the story. That's what Jesus taught me.